अपनी जान से प्यारा, नजर उठा के फिर जो देखा दोबारा, दुश्मन मिटा देंगे हम, दुश्मन गिरा देंगे हम, शाहीनों की है ये फिजा.
The tea is fantastic. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Newsroom special program on the second anniversary of Operation Swift Retort, which took place on the 27th of February 2019. This operation was in response to the infiltration across the line of control of Indian aircraft that came into Pakistani territory and were responded by Pakistani aircraft by the Pakistan Air Force, and they had to shed their payload and go back into Indian territory. However, at that time, Pakistan had said that we are going to give them a response, which did take place on the 27th of February when Pakistan Air Force jets went across the line of control into Indian-occupied Kashmir territory and then shot down 2 of their aircraft and captured 1 of their pilots. So let's have a look at this package and then we'll talk about this with our guests on the program.
Pakistan celebrates Surprise Day to honor its Air Force, which countered Indian strikes on 27 February 2019. On February 27th, warplanes from both sides engaged in a fight along the border of disputed Kashmir. Pakistan downed an Indian aircraft and arrested its pilot wing commander Abhinandan Varthaman along the de facto Kashmir border. But a day later, on February 28, Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan announced his release as a goodwill gesture. Meanwhile, the occupied valley is under lockdown since August 2019, when India, in a unilateral and illegal move, revoked Indian-occupied Kashmir's special status. Pakistan has been calling upon the international community to take notice of the deteriorating situation in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir and hold the Modi government accountable for its illegal actions, which are imperiling peace and stability in South Asia. In a recent development, the DGMOs of the 2 countries held discussions over the established mechanism of hotline contact. According to ISPR, both sides agreed for strict observance of all agreements, understandings and ceasefires along the line of control and all other sectors. India has been sponsoring terrorism in Pakistan, the human rights abuse carried out by the Indian forces in occupied Kashmir, and a 15-year-long disinformation campaign against Pakistan, which shows how much India is serious about bringing peace in the region. Pakistan has always promoted peace and rejected an unabated nuclear arms race while preserving a strategic balance.
To discuss with us this historical day, we're going to be talking to Lieutenant General Raza Mohammed, who is a senior analyst who's going to join us right now online, as well as Mr. Ali Sultan, who's an international law expert. Thank you so much, General Raza, for joining us, and Mr. Ali Sultan.
My pleasure.
General Sahab, I'm going to begin with you, and I would like to ask you that we saw what happened 2 years ago in 2019 in February, how much there was a tension simmering around this whole issue when the Pulwama attacks took place in India, and it was a very large terror attack with 44 Indian soldiers who were killed. And the blame obviously went on Pakistan, which is what usually happens. Yet no evidence was given. The Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, asked repeatedly to give evidence, credible evidence, and that we'll work with them. Yet they tried to, they had a posture of aggression. Would you like to comment on that, please?
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, I think very briefly the background. And in that, what is important is the Indian elections, which were scheduled to be held on 11th April 2019. Now, the Indian air raid at Balakot happened about 1.5 months prior to the Indian elections, and the objective of this attack was definitely not, to punish so-called terrorists or anything else, other than seeking political and electoral advantage for the PKC. And we all know the result, that as a consequence of that, India was thoroughly embarrassed once the PF undertook a retaliatory strike And of course, internationally and nationally, India was embarrassed. And I would just like to quote, the Associated Press, Reuters, then amongst the open source satellite imagery organizations like the Atlantic Council, Forensic Lab, the San Francisco-based Planet Lab, European Space Imagery, Australian Strategic Policy Institute, all of them, they actually came to the conclusions that there were no terrorists at Balakot, that the Indian attack had miserably failed, and that the Indians' lies were exposed. And therefore, I think the first lesson from that is for India, and that is that they should tell the truth and shame the devil. So I hope this lesson has been learned by them.
Right,
Secondly,
and
I
sir,
think
yes. Sir, what I'd like to ask you is Pakistan's response after that of shooting down the two Indian MiG-21 aircraft and then capturing the pilot and then as a gesture of peace returning him back to India. I'd like to ask you what was established on that day. Was it that Pakistan is able to show proper deterrence and responsibility internationally, etc.? What would you say, from a defense angle, what was proven on that day? What's the significance?
uh, I think from the Indian side first, there was total politico-military, I think, instability of the entire region was depicted by their actions, and the immaturity of their leadership was displayed because it was for the first time, I think, in many decades that one nuclear power undertook an airstrike against another nuclear power, endangering, the whole subcontinent and the whole South Asia. Pakistan, on the contrary, responded, I think, in a very matured manner. And I think you mentioned about that in the intro, that the entire Pakistani leadership, political leadership, and the military leadership only targeted those Indian targets which were quid pro quo, because there were no casualties on our side. So while the PF retaliated, but we made sure that there are no casualties on the other side, although in the close vicinity of the targets which were taken by the PF, senior military leadership of the Indian Army was present, but those targets were deliberately avoided.
Right,
Also,
absolutely. At this point, I'd also like to ask Mr. Ali Sultan to give your views on this. During that time, we all remember the war hysteria that had built up by the Indian media and by the public over there. And on the contrary, what we saw in Pakistan was both our military as well as civilian leadership showing a lot of responsibility, restraint, as well as the public and the media, and calling for peace.
Yes, well, thank you for having me, first of all. Look, the first thing to remember is that, of course, the response of Pakistan was very mature, and India was really exposed as an immature and an irresponsible state, a state whose political dispensation at the moment uses aggression in order to win elections. And of course, now there is a whole body of evidence beginning from Arnab Goswami's WhatsApp chat transcripts, which conclusively demonstrate that the Pulwama incident was a contrived incident. It was contrived so that this false narrative in India could be built that Pakistan is sponsoring terrorism, and then that would be used as a justification to engage in aggression against all norms and violations of international law, including the United Nations Charter. That's what they did when they unsuccessfully tried to militarily strike us in Balakot, when all that they could fell were a few trees at the end of the day. And then, of course, in response to this act of aggression, which, as I've said, was was stage managed in response to a contrived incident at Pulwama. Um, and the object, of course, was to whip up anti-Pakistan hysteria, especially among the Hindu far right in India. So anyhow, in response to this act of aggression, then of course the Pakistan Air Force in Operation Swift Retort retaliated in kind, and that response was proportional, and that response was according to international law because it was an action in self-defense, which was
Right.
necessary for us to establish our, our commitment and our resolve, and also to demonstrate to India that if ever India engages in aggression against Pakistan, the response is going to be swift and proportionate.
Right.
So
And I think the
that's an
message got across loud and clear. General Raza, I'd like to ask you at this point that at that time, the statement said that Pakistan undertook strikes across the LOC, locked Indian targets, but did not strike them. And also, India had also claimed at that time that it had shot down a Pakistan Air Force aircraft, an F-16, which later was found to be untrue. Your comments on these two things, sir, that what was the meaning of locking the Indian targets but not striking them?
Well, as I said earlier, because Pakistan had not suffered any human casualty, so therefore it was decided by the political military leadership that our response should be proportional. And that was the answer. And of course, the Indian lies were also exposed very clearly there. And many independent observers, including the United States, they confirmed that Pakistan had not lost any aircraft and that India had lost at least one fighter aircraft and one helicopter, which had six Indian Air Force officials. Uh, so I think we hope that India has learned the lesson that Pakistan has fully demonstrated that it cannot be petrified. So it must shun its ignorance and arrogance and shouldn't dare to mess with it in future. Because if they do so, it will hurt India more, as Pakistan has continuously displayed the resolve of striking back whenever its territorial integrity is threatened, which includes the Azad Kashmir areas and sea coast and all other areas.
Right. Ali Sultan, now I'd like to come to you that you were talking about the fact that the Balakot attacks and the blaming of Pakistan was all contrived. And we've seen this happening time and again when there are attacks in India, that they always come up with claims about militant attacks being carried out by Pakistan in their country. And Pakistan has always vehemently denied any involvement with any terrorist activities across the border. Your comments on this?
Well, yes, we have to understand, the Indian playbook essentially is to contrive an incident, then blame it on Pakistan, whip up anti-Pakistan hysteria inside India, and then, engage in acts of aggression as they did in Balakot, and then, of course, also engage in a smear campaign against Pakistan that has been exposed now through the EU Disinfo Lab report, which really delves into the extent to which India and the depths to which India can stoop to in order to defame Pakistan internationally through identity thefts, using international organizations, abusing their mechanisms, and so on and so forth. So it allows them to engage in propaganda against Pakistan, and then of course they sell this to their public, which unfortunately is goaded on by a media which is completely captured right now by the far right in India, at least their mainstream media. And all of this, of course, ends up making things extremely dangerous in South Asia, a region where we have two powers, India and Pakistan, both heavily armed. We cannot afford to raise the temperatures to such a level as the Indian government is, is engaged in doing in the last few years.
Right. General Reza, now at the same time when these Pulwama attacks took place, during the same time frame, the International Court of Justice was hearing the case about Kulbhushan Yadav being an Indian spy who was caught on Pakistan territory. And Pakistan has repeatedly brought about our claims about Indian terrorist activity within our country. Your comments on this, sir?
Well, I think before I answer that question, let me very clearly say that I think the Indian political military leadership during that attack, it was actually swayed and driven perhaps by the delusions of Israeli-style air power tactics against Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, but they were absolutely disconnected from the realities of the dominant air power environment in which Israel was operating. And therefore, I think the Indian raids were very poorly planned and executed. And I think the whole world came to know about it. And therefore, I think India became a liability for some of the big powers which thought that they could contain China and control Pakistan through that. So clearly, India was playing with fire at the lower end of the nuclear spectrum and Armageddon at the upper end. Having said that, the issue of Kulbhushan and his trial, uh, I think that that issue is still alive. I think the path finally decide what to do with Kulbhushan, and I think the issue of human rights of Kulbhushan should be compared with the large number of innocent Pakistanis which were killed by Kulbhushan and his masters in Balochistan, in Sindh, in Karachi, and elsewhere in Pakistan. So that is all that I want to say about that case. Finally, I'd like to very quickly add that there were three countries which actually condoned India. And the first one was the United States, because at that time, the Trump administration that was supportive of Indian actions and they called it counter-terrorism operation. So I think we should never forget that. France again was the country which condoned the Indian attacks, and indirectly Israel was involved because the missiles which were used against Pakistan by the Indian Air Force were of Israeli origin. It is something else that the Indian Air Force was professionally so incompetent that they could not properly use those missiles. So I think in the annals of history, I think all uh, these these political or international sort of opinions and support to India must be remembered by us. And I hope that those powers also now realize the purposes for which this raid was carried out by India and why it was carried out by them and what should they expect from India in the future.
Right, exactly. Now, Ali Sultan, this was the first aerial attack since 1971 between the two countries, and it was very dangerous because both are nuclear-armed countries. And then we saw a whole spate of the United Nations and different countries asking the two countries to show restraint. And there was a lot of this came to a sort of a boiling point, which could have been very, very potentially dangerous for the subcontinent.
Well, that's true. And at that moment, Pakistan, of course, acted very responsibly, very maturely, and of course, strictly in accordance with international law, including Geneva Conventions, and as a cooling off gesture of peace and maturity and responsibility from our side, we handed back, their captured pilot, Abhinandan, uh, which is a gesture of peace and, of course, as I said, maturity and responsibility. So that was the right thing to do at the moment. But of course, we should always be mindful and alive to the fact that eventually it will be India. The onus is in India to not just reciprocate such mature gestures from Pakistan, but to create endurable conditions of peace in subcontinent. And that can only happen if the political aspirations of the Kashmiris are met through a free, fair, and impartial plebiscite, as the United Nations Security Council resolutions call for. So that's the road to endurable peace in South Asia, which I think India, of course, has the onus as I said, of creating the conditions that would lead to such peace, and not, of course, engage in illegal and unilateral actions such as the 5th August 2019.
Right, exactly. General Reza, now the current human rights situation in Kashmir, that is still a very difficult point right now for Pakistan to kind of cope with, because we've seen Prime Minister Imran Khan recently, he gave a statement that he wants to see a resolution to disputes in the subcontinent. And at the same time, the Human Rights Minister, Shireen Mazari, said at the Human Rights Conference, on her video conference, that, the Western world needs to stop being duplicitous and stop playing a double game when it comes to human rights. This is still a very large area of contention that's still lingering, sir.
Yes, the human rights issue, I think, is very dear, I think, to uh, all responsible countries of the world. And some of these countries have actually put pressure on India, some direct and some indirect. The Biden administration now, I think, has a very big responsibility. They start respecting the human rights, not only in Kashmir, but also in mainland India, and particularly the human rights violations of the Indian Muslims and the issue of Islamophobia over there. We hope that, as the foreign minister said, the OIC countries would also understand the sentiments of the Muslims of the world and apply not only political but also economic pressures on India, either directly, individually, or through the OIC, so that these violations stop. Now coming back, to the main issue, I'd like to say, remind the Indian audience that, God forbid, if India had actually, martyred 300 to 400 Pakistanis as they intended to do in 2019 February, the situation would have been absolutely different. And one could imagine the kind of pressures uh, that would have been that the Pakistani political military leadership would have faced to retaliate. And if that had continued, I think that would have meant the start of a full-fledged war, which
Right.
nobody could control. And on that occasion, I think some very irresponsible statements were given by Modi when he actually threatened Pakistan with missile strikes and called it Qatl ki Raat. He even made a mention of, obliquely made a mention of the use of nuclear weapons when he said that the Indian nuclear weapons are not there for Diwali. And this was then repeated by the Indian defense minister. So I think the world needs to take a very serious note of this, and they should now be convinced that the Indian nuclear weapons have actually physically completely fallen into the wrong hands, and they should be really not only worried about it, but also do something to ensure that this threat, which is not only against Pakistan, but the whole of Asia and by extension the rest of the world, that this threat is diminished. And the only way of doing that is to put complete and full political pressures on the BJP and the RSS government. And the second way is for the people of India to realize, how irresponsible and how reckless the present Indian leadership is.
Right. We also have online with us now Dr. Manzoor Afridi, who's an expert in foreign affairs. Thank you, Dr. Manzoor Afridi, for joining us online.
My pleasure.
Dr. Afridi, now I'd like to ask you in the same lines along which we were just having this discussion about India's human rights record. Now we're seeing what happens in Indian occupied Kashmir, then there's also what's happening with the protests around the country, etc. And we're also, do you see any pressure coming about that's going to cause that country to act a little bit more responsibly in this regard?
Of course, the human rights violations has been increased, especially and for the third time in the Indian history. So now, especially after the 5th August 2019, the provocation of the Article 370 and 35A. So the whole world witnessed about the gross human rights abuses in the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Because the BJP government, it is on the ideology of Hindutva, and Hindutva, it means for the superiority of the Hindu majority in the Indian state. So for this reason, they are doing all the strategies to carry out this policy, and already what the Narendra Modi had slogan, and he had campaigned for the construction of the Ram Mandir at the site of the Babri Mosque, and also the abrogation of these articles. So the same have been done by the Modi government. Now, with this, there is a rise of violence and Hindutva doctrine that has been implemented and institutionalized. So the world community is watching this, but it is very unfortunate that how they are not taking very strict action against the Indian brutalities and the Indian state-sponsored terrorism in the occupied Jammu and Kashmir Valley. So, of course, now it's high time for the world community to take notice of it, not only the United States and other powers, but most important, that is United Nations organization, which is mainly responsible, especially its Security Council, to have a look on the Indian atrocities and all these brutalities. And let me tell you that flagship operations are very important in this regard, that India is concealing its identity and its true face from the world, that how it is going to carry on the gross human rights violations. And the Pulwama attack of 2019 February, that was not for the first time. Even before, in 1971, there was a hijacking of an airplane which was coming from Delhi to Lahore, and it was a drama which was planned by the Indian intelligence agencies, and later on it was blamed on Pakistan. After that, we have also seen the Mumbai attacks, and there are reports of the Indian officials that they disclosed that it was just a very fake encounter planned by the Indian government. After that, we have also seen the Samjhauta Express, and that was also planned by the Indian authorities and the Indian forces. And the latest one, that is this February Pulwama attack, which was the deadliest since 1989, the armed struggle of the Kashmiri Mujahideen. So it was again planned by the Indian authorities, and now in future they may plan the same attacks, and they will blame, of course, Pakistan. So now the world community has to realize all these atrocities and all these planning what the the Indian intelligence agency and the Indian political and security forces, they are doing in this regard, because it is a volatile region where the two nuclear powers, India and Pakistan, they are existing here, and at any time, God forbid, that there can be a flash point of nuclear war between the two countries. No doubt that Pakistan maintains the minimum deterrence against India, but any misadventure, it creates such kind of opportunity. And another thing, what I want to share with you, that that is the line of control. Every time Pakistani government has allowed the international community, the observers, the United Nations military observers and also the media outlets, the international media, that they have to look on the Pakistani side of line of control and also the Pakistani Azad Jammu and Kashmir. And every time they were very much satisfied with the reporting and with the ground realities what Pakistan showed to them. But on the other hand, on the Indian side of line of control, on the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, they were not allowing these human rights organizations, the United Nations officials, and the media organizations to have
Right, so then
free and
overall
fair
lack of
reporting.
transparency on the Indian side, where they're denying access to international media and diplomats in the Indian occupied Kashmir territory. Thank you, Dr. Manzoor Afridi, for joining us on the program. Now, coming back to Mr. Ali Sultan, I'd like to ask you now, in the recent developments that we are seeing as of yesterday, that the two DGMOs, the Director Generals of Military Operations of India and Pakistan, both had their telephonic conversations, and they decided to resume the LOC ceasefire agreement of 2003. Now, this was a very welcome development. Do you see this as a sort of harbinger of peace going forward? Do you think that this might lead to further sort of dialogue? And because they've also talked about addressing points of contention which could escalate into violence. Do you see this developing anytime in the future?
Well, first of all, of course, it's definitely a welcome development. Here's a cooling off mechanism which has been utilized by the DGMO in order to, again, show our commitment to international law, because through this, we are hoping that India will also honor its commitment of not violating the ceasefire agreement, because don't forget, there have been countless ceasefire violations in the last few years, especially from 2014 onwards, and the brunt of that was on the civilian population in AJK. They were really suffering, from the use of heavy Indian mortar and shelling. So that it comes as a welcome break for the residents and civilians in AJK, where some normalcy.
Right, because in AJK you have casualties ranging from the age of 2-year-olds to 75-year-olds. These people have nothing to do with any sort of conflict. They're just innocent villagers living their day-to-day lives, and they were losing their lives every single day. And as you said, from the year 2014, it escalated, and after the revocation of Article 370 and 35A, it got even worse. And you were hearing of more and more civilian casualties as well as military ones.
Right, that's true. But now that this cooling off mechanism has been utilized, and we hope that India will honor its commitment and not engage in ceasefire violations, moving forward, as I was saying earlier also, now the onus is really on India to create those right conditions for peace, those conditions that could lead to an enduring peace. And that can only be achieved through a just and lawful settlement under international law of the Kashmir dispute. And also, of course, that guarantees the right of self-determination to the Kashmiris. So unless that is honored, we can't really hope for enduring peace in South Asia. So now we hope that better sense will prevail in India, and moving forward, they would start reversing the illegal actions that they've been engaged in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir since August 5, 2019, and also, of course, put a stop to the countless various human rights violations that they've been perpetrating in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, not just since August 2019, but for many, many decades before that as well. So that's what's really going to determine whether this cooling off mechanism will eventually lead to some form of enduring peace or not. So let's remain optimistic and hopeful at this point.
Absolutely. General Reza, would you say, because in the previous US administration, President Trump had said that he would like to see India and Pakistan get along, and he said that, he'd like to mediate, but we didn't really see any developments where that was concerned. It actually, the situation kept getting worse. However, now with the coming of the Biden administration, do you think that that might have had a positive effect on allowing the two neighbors to sort of speak on more positive terms, as you might say?
Well, I think let's just wait and hope and see that the Biden administration can adopt a more balanced approach. And let's hope that their policies are not colored by their efforts to use or misuse India to contain China and definitely not to control Pakistan. But what they need to know is that under the BJP RSS government, India has changed drastically. India is no more India. It is actually Hindustan. It is a country for the Hindus, by the Hindus, and that's it. I think they need to actually change that. And they have been changing regimes all over the world, mainly for two reasons. One is their own interest, and the other is to ensure that particular reason, both these reasons are there. And they should either prevail on the current government to change their policies, or then, probably do something to change this regime. Secondly, they need to be very cognizant of the large scale budget allocations for the massive inductions of technology for the Indian armed forces, despite the fact that the Indian economy is in a recession because of the COVID-19 situation and because of their own creation of a two-front war situation there on all their, or a three-front situation on all their borders. So that is, a matter of not only concern for Pakistan, but it should also be for all friends of India, particularly the United States and Russia. I think the United States should prevail upon Israel to stop selling weapons and equipment to India, like Germany has recently done it, because all that equipment is likely to be used against Pakistan, and bulk of it is likely to be used against the innocent Kashmiris as well. I think all these things hopefully should influence the policies of the new Biden administrations, and these policies should also be marked and noted by all the members of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, because if that is not done, I think stability in South Asia is not going to come, and the peace process in Afghanistan is also going to be in danger.
Right. Ali Sultan, any concluding remarks from you regarding this particular situation between India and Pakistan? Where do you see it heading going forward? Do you see mutual dialogue beginning at any time soon? We are seeing that India has also started de-escalating its tensions across the border with China as well. And it's just recently done that with Pakistan. Yet at the same time, it's still a key partner of the US to sort of balance out the power with China. Where do you see all of this going forward in the future? Considering India's track record and the trust deficit where exporting terrorism is concerned and human rights violations and disinformation, etc. is concerned, where do you see this going forward?
Well, look, the hope, of course, at this point is that India will turn out to be sincere this time around. So we need to wait and watch whether they will abide by the commitment to ceasefire along the LOC, and of course also, keep putting pressure on them to reverse the actions of August 5th, 2019, and also put a stop to the human rights violations in IOJK. So unless India can demonstrably act along those lines, the rightful conditions for peace would not be created, and any further progress would be difficult at this point. So it's premature to comment or conclude anything at this point in terms of where things will be in the future. A lot depends on whether the United States act as an honest broker between Pakistan and India, and as General Saab was also saying, is not excessively colored in in its ambitions to contain China and using India as a net security provider as far as that is concerned. So that's also in the mix at this point. So let's remain hopeful and optimistic. Let's look at the glass half full and not half empty, and hope that better sense prevails in New Delhi, and that enduring conditions for peace are created, because that's something which the people of both the countries deserve. They have deserved this for decades. But India, of course, needs to shed its arrogance and, of course, some of its intransigence when it comes to the Kashmir dispute, if this is to be a reality.
Right. Thank you, Ali Sultan, for joining us on our program today. And thank you, Lieutenant General Raza Mohammed, as well, for participating in today's special program on the second anniversary of Operation Swift Retort, where Pakistan showed that it can deter any sort of threat from across any border within our country by the expertise that the Pakistan Air Force showed on the 27th of February in 2019. Thank you for joining us on our program, and we'll see you next time.